The market was loud, filled with the sound of voices, machines, and creatures. It was a place where the strong came to show their power and the weak were displayed as items to be sold. Stalls stretched across the square, filled with strange goods from many worlds, but one side of the market was different. Behind metal bars, humans stood in chains. Mara stood among them, her wrists bound, her clothes worn. She had been taken from her home months ago, captured when soldiers from the alien empire raided her village. She had seen her people scattered and sold. Some were taken as workers, some as playthings, and some vanished into the darkness. She had no hope left, only fear of what would come next. Buyers walked past the cages. Some laughed as they pointed, others studied the slaves with cold eyes. Mara lowered her head, not wanting to draw attention. She had learned that to look at buyers was dangerous. A buyer could see defiance in the eyes and punish it, or see weakness and use it for cruelty. Better to remain quiet and unnoticed. Yet on this day, a man approached who was different. He was not an alien but a human like her. He wore simple clothes, though his shoulders carried the look of someone trained for battle. His eyes were sharp, but his face showed little emotion. He stopped before her cage, and for a moment, Mara dared to look at him. His name, though she did not know it yet, was Dan. The guards at the stall noticed him and moved quickly, eager to make a sale. One of them struck the bars with a rod, forcing Mara to step forward. "This one is strong," the guard said. "Young, healthy. She will serve well. For work or for other needs." His tone was sly, the kind of tone that made Mara's heart tighten with dread. Dan said nothing. He studied Mara in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into his belt and pulled out a small metal disc. It was a payment token, heavy with value. He handed it to the guard without bargaining. The guard grinned wide and unlocked the cage. Mara froze. She could hardly breathe as the man reached for her chain. She had seen many girls bought before. Some had cried out, some had begged, but all had been taken away to fates worse than death. Her body shook as Dan took hold of the chain and led her out of the cage. The crowd looked on with knowing smiles. To them, it was another simple purchase. A man buying a slave for his own dark reasons. Some whispered, some laughed, and Mara's heart sank. She could not stop her mind from imagining the pain that awaited her. Dan did not speak as he guided her through the market. His steps were steady, his grip firm but not cruel. Mara followed, her eyes fixed on the ground. She did not dare to ask questions. She only thought of what would happen when they reached his home or his den. Every sound of the market faded behind her as she was taken into the streets. The city around them was a place of stone and metal, filled with high towers and glowing signs. Strange machines moved across the roads, carrying goods and people. Aliens of many kinds walked past, some tall, some short, some covered in scales or fur. Mara felt small among them, her chain clinking softly as she walked behind Dan. She expected him to take her to one of the shadowed houses or to a hidden room where she would face pain. Instead, he led her beyond the busy streets, toward the edge of the city. There, small transport craft waited. Dan guided her to one, opened the door, and gestured for her to enter. Her hands trembled as she stepped inside. The craft was simple, with 2 seats in the front and space in the back. She sat down, her chain heavy in her lap. Dan closed the door behind them and started the engine. The craft rose into the air with a low hum, carrying them away from the city. For the first time, Mara dared to glance at him. He kept his eyes forward, focused on the controls. His jaw was set, his face calm. She saw no cruelty there, but that did not ease her fear. Silence filled the craft, broken only by the sound of the engine. Mara wanted to ask him why he had bought her. She wanted to beg him not to hurt her. But her voice would not come. She had been silenced too many times, and the fear of punishment pressed heavy on her chest. She lowered her eyes again and held her silence. Hours seemed to pass as the craft moved beyond the city, across wide plains and dark forests. The sky shifted with the light of distant suns. Mara's mind was a storm of fear, yet she noticed something strange. Dan did not look at her with hunger or cruelty. He did not laugh or gloat as many buyers did. He simply drove, his focus fixed on the horizon. At last, the craft descended into a valley hidden by high cliffs. Tall trees lined the ground, and mist hung in the air. Dan guided the craft down onto a flat stone surface and shut off the engine. He opened the door and stepped out, then gave a small nod for her to follow. Mara hesitated but obeyed. Her bare feet touched the cold stone as she stepped outside. Around them was silence, broken only by the sound of wind through the trees. She looked around with wide eyes. There were no houses, no guards, no other buyers. Only wilderness. Dan walked ahead, leading her toward a dark opening in the cliff. It looked like the entrance to a cave, wide and deep. As they neared, Mara's fear grew again. What was inside? Was this where he planned to keep her hidden? But when they entered, the darkness gave way to light. Panels along the walls came to life, glowing softly as if sensing their presence. The air felt different, filled with a hum of power. It was not a simple cave. It was something built long ago, something human. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen such a place. Machines lined the walls, old but not dead. Symbols of human design marked the doors. She turned to Dan in confusion, but he did not explain. He only released her chain from his hand and walked deeper inside, his voice calm as he spoke for the first time. "You are safe here." The words were simple, but they struck Mara harder than chains ever had. Safe. The word felt strange on her ears. She wanted to believe it, yet her heart still pounded with doubt. Why would a man buy her only to bring her here? Dan looked back at her, his eyes steady. He gave no more answers, not yet. But in that moment, Mara felt the faintest spark of something she had not felt in a long time. A question. A hope. Perhaps her story was not ending after all. Perhaps it was only beginning. The tunnel stretched deep into the cliff, silent except for the sound of Mara's footsteps. She followed Dan, her chain still around her wrists but no longer held by him. The walls glowed with faint light as if the place itself had awakened when they entered. She had never seen anything like it. The air was cooler here, cleaner, carrying the faint hum of hidden machines. Mara's fear had not left her. She walked with her head lowered, waiting for the moment when his true purpose would be revealed. A man did not spend so much in the market for nothing. She thought of the other girls who had been bought. Their stories always ended in pain. She told herself not to trust the strange calmness of the soldier. Dan stopped at a large chamber, its ceiling high, its walls lined with consoles and old screens. Dust covered much of it, yet the glow of light showed that power still flowed through hidden wires. At the center of the room was a table with supplies laid out: food packets, water flasks, blankets. Mara's stomach tightened at the sight of food. It had been days since she had eaten anything more than scraps. Dan placed his pack on the table and began sorting through the supplies. His movements were steady, practiced. He did not look at her or speak. For a long moment, the silence pressed on her. She could hear only her own heartbeat and the faint hum of the machines. At last, Dan pushed a small packet of food toward her and set a flask of water beside it. "Eat," he said simply. Mara hesitated. Her hands trembled as she reached for the packet. She expected him to pull it away, to laugh, to use her hunger against her. But he did not. He turned away and began to adjust a console at the side of the room. Slowly, Mara opened the packet. Inside was dried bread and small pieces of fruit. Her throat tightened as she ate, the taste filling her mouth with life she had almost forgotten. The water cooled her throat, washing away days of dust and fear. For a brief moment, she felt human again. But the fear soon returned. Why would he feed her? What did he want from her? No master gave food without a price. She watched Dan from the corner of her eye. He stood before the console, tapping keys that woke the screen with faint light. His face remained calm, his focus away from her. When she finished eating, Mara sat quietly, clutching the flask in her hands. She thought about running, but the memory of the forest outside returned to her. She had no map, no tools, no strength. If she fled, the wild would swallow her long before she found freedom. She was trapped, not by chains alone but by the walls of this strange place and by her own fear. Hours passed in silence. Dan moved through the chamber, checking supplies, repairing small devices, and writing notes on a tablet. Mara sat against the wall, her eyes following him. She could not understand him. Every master she had seen before had been loud, cruel, or quick to anger. Dan was none of these. He spoke little and acted with quiet purpose. Night came, though the tunnels did not change. Dan gave her a blanket and pointed to a corner where she could rest. He did not lock her in a cage or tie her down. He did not even take her chain. He simply lay on his own blanket on the opposite side of the room and closed his eyes. Mara stayed awake for a long time, staring at him through the dim light. She expected him to rise in the dark, to reveal the cruelty she feared. But he did not move. His breathing grew steady, the breath of someone who trusted the silence of the night. For the first time in months, Mara slept on a blanket instead of the cold ground. Yet her sleep was restless. She dreamed of chains, of buyers' voices, of the moment he had taken her from the market. When she woke, her body was covered in sweat, but the man was still sleeping, untouched by nightmares. The next day followed the same pattern. Dan gave her food and water, then returned to his work. He left her free to walk the chamber, though he always kept part of his attention on her. Mara tested the doors but found them sealed by locks she could not open. She touched the old machines, wondering what they were for. Some hummed faintly, others were silent, their secrets hidden by dust. Her fear of him did not fade, but curiosity began to rise. Why bring her here? Why treat her with quietness instead of cruelty? He had not asked her to clean, to serve, or to obey. He had not touched her or punished her. He had only fed her and allowed her rest. On the third day, her voice finally broke the silence. Why? She asked, her words soft, almost lost in the air. Dan paused in his work but did not turn. Eat, he said again, as if he had not heard the question. Frustration stirred in Mara's chest. She had expected harshness, but his silence was worse. She wanted answers, yet he gave none. She thought of shouting, of demanding, but fear kept her quiet. She returned to her corner, hugging the blanket around herself. That night, as she lay awake, she listened to the hum of the machines and the quiet sound of his breathing. She thought of her village, of the family she had lost. She thought of the chains still on her wrists. She thought of the man who had bought her and wondered if he was truly different, or if his silence only hid his cruelty until the right moment came. Dan rose early, before she opened her eyes. He checked the entrance, scanned the sky with a small device, and returned with a watchful look. Mara saw tension in his shoulders, as if he expected danger. His eyes often lifted upward, to the sky beyond the cliffs. It was then Mara realized something. His silence was not the silence of cruelty. It was the silence of waiting. Waiting for something greater than her. Still, she could not understand. She hugged her knees close to her chest and whispered to herself, too soft for him to hear. Why me? Dan gave no answer. He kept working, kept scanning the skies, his face set in calm determination. Mara watched him and wondered what secret he carried, what reason had led him to the market that day, and why he had chosen her among all the others. Her fear was still strong, but for the first time, it was joined by another feeling. Curiosity. Mara woke to the sound of metal shifting. Her eyes opened to see Dan moving crates across the chamber. The glow of the walls lit the room with a pale light, showing the dust that hung in the air. She sat up slowly, still wrapped in the blanket he had given her. Her chain clinked softly as she moved. Dan noticed she was awake. He did not greet her, but he set a packet of food on the table near her. The same plain bread and fruit as before. She took it in silence, eating quickly, her hunger stronger than her pride. He returned to his work, dragging another crate across the floor and setting it beside the others. Mara's eyes followed him. She had spent days in this place now, and still she did not understand. He had not hurt her, but he had not explained either. His silence was a wall she could not break. Yet her curiosity grew stronger each day. When she finished eating, she rose and moved slowly toward the far side of the chamber. She had explored a little before, but fear had kept her from going too far. Now, her steps carried her toward one of the darker tunnels that stretched deeper into the cliff. Dan's voice stopped her. "Not there." She froze, turning to see him watching her. His eyes were calm but firm. He set down the crate and walked closer. "That part is not safe," he said. "Old traps. Old defenses. You stay here." Mara lowered her head, ashamed. She returned to her corner without a word. He did not scold her further. He only went back to his work. The day passed in silence until Dan finally spoke again. He stood at a console, tapping keys that brought symbols onto the screen. The symbols were human, though old, written in a style Mara had never learned. He studied them carefully, then spoke without turning. "This place belonged to humans once," he said. "Long before the Empire took control." Mara's heart quickened. She stepped closer, daring to ask. "What is it?" "A base," Dan replied. "Hidden. Forgotten. Most of it still works." Mara looked around with new eyes. The glowing walls, the silent machines, the sealed doors, it all began to make sense. She had thought it was only a strange cave, but now she realized it was something greater. A place built by her own people, left behind in secret. Dan finally turned to face her. "The Empire does not know about it. That is why we are safe here. For now." The word we caught her off guard. No master she had ever seen would include a slave in such a word. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat felt dry. Dan studied her for a moment, then turned back to the console. His voice was steady, without emotion. "I did not buy you to harm you." The words struck her harder than chains. She stared at him, unsure if she could believe. Every memory of the market, every cruel face of buyers, told her not to trust. Yet his voice carried no lies. "Then why?" she whispered. He did not answer at once. He worked in silence, his fingers moving over the console. Finally, he said, "Because you will be safer with me than with anyone else there." Mara's chest tightened. She wanted to believe, but doubt still clung to her. Safe was not a word she trusted. Safe had been taken from her the day her village burned. She lowered her head, unsure if she could accept his words. Over the next days, Mara began to see more of the base. Dan allowed her to follow him through the chambers that were safe. She saw old storage rooms filled with sealed crates, long tables covered in dust, and machines that hummed softly with hidden power. Some doors remained locked, sealed by codes Dan had not yet broken. One chamber held rows of sleeping pods, empty but still glowing with faint light. Another chamber had walls lined with strange weapons, their design unlike anything she had seen before. Dan warned her not to touch them. He spoke little, but his words carried weight, and Mara obeyed. She began to notice small things about him. He moved with discipline, his steps steady, his actions careful. He checked the entrance each morning, scanning the sky with a device before beginning his work. He ate little, always after giving her food first. His eyes often carried a faraway look, as if he was waiting for something beyond the walls. Mara's fear did not vanish, but it began to change. It was no longer fear of cruelty. It was fear of the unknown. Dan was not like other men she had seen. He treated her with distance, but also with a strange kind of care. He did not treat her as an object, yet he did not treat her as a friend either. One evening, as they sat in silence, Mara dared to speak again. "Why do you stay here? Why not live in the city?" Dan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because the city belongs to them. This place belongs to us." "Us," she repeated. "Humans," he said simply. The word filled her with warmth she did not expect. For so long, she had felt like nothing more than property, a body to be sold and used. To hear someone speak of her as part of us stirred something deep inside her. But with that warmth came fear. Why had he chosen her, out of all the slaves in the market? Why had he paid so much for someone like her? She asked the question at last. "Why me?" Dan's gaze met hers. His eyes were calm, steady, carrying secrets she could not read. "Because you matter," he said. Her breath caught. The words echoed in her mind, impossible to believe yet impossible to ignore. She had not mattered to anyone since the day her family was taken. She wanted to demand what he meant, but his silence returned. He gave no more answers, leaving her with questions that burned inside her. That night, as she lay on her blanket, Mara stared at the ceiling. She thought of the machines, of the base, of Dan's words. She thought of the world beyond the cliffs, ruled by the empire that had stolen her life. For the first time, a thought came to her that she had not dared to hold before. Perhaps she was not meant to remain a slave. Perhaps her story was not over. And as she drifted into uneasy sleep, she realized something else. Dan had not only given her food and safety. He had given her a spark she thought she had lost forever. Hope. The days inside the base began to feel different for Mara. At first, they had been filled with silence and fear, but now she noticed small changes. Dan spoke more often, though never many words at once. He showed her how to use the water system, how to warm food, and how to move through the safe tunnels. It was still not freedom, but it was more than chains. Yet questions grew inside her like a storm. She wanted to understand why he had bought her. She wanted to know what he meant when he said she mattered. Each time she asked, his answer was the same silence. She grew restless with it, and one evening, when he sat at the console again, she finally pressed harder. "You said I matter," Mara said, her voice shaking but steady enough to carry. "What does that mean? Why me, out of everyone in the cages? Why did you choose me?" Dan did not answer at once. He continued typing, the screen glowing with lines of old human symbols. Finally, he stopped and turned his chair to face her. His eyes were calm, but behind them she saw a weight, as if he had been holding something for a long time. "There is a reason," he said quietly. Mara leaned closer, her heart racing. "Tell me." Dan stood and walked to one of the locked doors on the far side of the chamber. He placed his hand on the panel, and with a low hum, the door slid open. Light spilled into the room, revealing a smaller chamber filled with machines unlike any she had seen before. At the center stood a console covered in dust, its surface shaped like a table with glowing lines running across it. He gestured for her to follow. Mara hesitated but obeyed. She stepped into the chamber, her eyes wide as she took in the strange machines. The air here felt heavier, as if the walls held secrets long hidden. Dan stopped at the console and placed his hand on it. The lines of light brightened, pulsing with energy, but only faintly. This base was built long ago by humans who came before us, he said. They built weapons, defenses, machines of great power. The Empire feared them, so they tried to destroy everything. But some places were hidden, sealed away, waiting to be awakened. Mara listened, unsure where his words were leading. Her hands trembled as she clutched her chain. Dan turned to her, his face steady. The machines here cannot be opened by me. They were locked by those who built them. Only certain people can awaken them. Mara frowned. What do you mean? Blood, Dan said simply. A bloodline. A family line that carries the key inside them. Your family. Mara froze. The words struck her like thunder. My family, she whispered. Dan nodded. Your village was not attacked by chance. The Empire knew who lived there. They wanted to erase your family's line. They feared what you carry. That is why they sold you instead of killing you. They wanted to scatter you, to make sure no one could find you. But I found you. Mara's knees felt weak. She stepped back, shaking her head. No, I am no one. Just a slave. Dan's voice grew firmer. You are more than that. You have something inside you they cannot erase. You are the key to the space. He pointed to the console. Place your hand there. Mara's chest rose and fell with quick breaths. She looked at the console as if it were a trap. What if I cannot? What if nothing happens? Then we will know, Dan said. But I believe you can. That is why I chose you. That is why you matter. Her mind swirled with doubt and fear. All her life since capture had told her she was worthless, only a body to be sold and used. And yet here was the soldier, telling her she was the key to something greater. She wanted to run, but part of her wanted to know the truth. Slowly, with trembling hands, Mara stepped forward. She raised her hand and pressed it to the surface of the console. For a long moment, nothing happened. Her heart sank. She began to pull away, but then a surge of light spread beneath her hand. The lines across the console flared bright, racing outward like fire. The walls of the chamber lit with symbols, glowing with power that had slept for years. A deep hum filled the air, strong and alive. Mara gasped and stepped back, her hand shaking as she pulled it away. The console remained alive, its screen showing new symbols that Dan quickly began to read. He smiled faintly, the first true smile she had seen from him. It works, he whispered. You are the one. Mara's eyes widened. Her breath came fast. I did that. Yes, Dan said. The base has accepted you. It will listen to you. Only you. Her legs felt weak. She sank to the floor, her mind spinning. She thought of her family, of the faces she had lost. She thought of the night her village burned. Could it be that her suffering had meaning? Could it be that she was more than chains? Dan knelt beside her, his voice steady but softer now. You are not a slave, Mara. Not anymore. You are the key to awakening what remains of our people's strength. With your help, we can fight back. Humanity can rise again. She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. I am not strong. I cannot fight. I do not know how. You do not need to fight as I do, Dan said. You have already done more than any soldier could. You have awakened hope. That is what the Empire fears most. His words sank into her heart, stirring something she had buried long ago. Hope. She remembered her father's voice, telling her once that she carried something important, though she had not understood. Perhaps this was what he had meant. She looked at Dan, her voice trembling. And if I refuse? Then I will not force you, he said simply. I will keep you safe here as long as I can. But I believe you will not refuse. I believe you want to see your people free. Mara stared at the glowing walls. She felt the warmth of the console still in her hand, the hum of power still in her chest. For the first time since her capture, she felt more than fear. She felt a choice before her. At last, she whispered, "What do I need to do?" Dan rose, offering his hand. "Learn. And trust yourself." Mara hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, not of a master holding a slave but of a soldier standing beside a partner. She stood, her heart still racing, but her voice carried new strength. "I will try." Dan nodded once. "That is all I ask." And with that, the machines of the old base hummed louder, as if awakening to the promise of a new beginning. The base felt different after the console lit up under Mara's hand. The air carried a steady hum, and faint lights glowed in tunnels that had been dark for years. Mara walked through the chambers and felt as if unseen eyes were watching her, not with malice but with recognition. The base seemed alive, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Dan noticed the change as well. He moved with new purpose, checking screens that now showed streams of symbols. He spoke more than before, explaining the functions of different consoles, showing her where power flowed and how the systems connected. Mara listened carefully, though many of the words were strange to her. Each time she touched a panel, the machines reacted. Lights brightened, doors unlocked, and systems came online. It frightened her at first. She was only a girl who had once been chained in a cage. How could she control machines built by humans long before her time? But Dan never doubted. Each time she hesitated, he encouraged her with calm words. "The base knows you. Trust it. Trust yourself." One morning, he brought her to a wide chamber with walls lined by screens. At the center stood a tall device shaped like a tower. "This is the heart of the base," Dan said. "It controls defense, communication, and the power grid. But it needs your touch to wake fully." Mara stepped forward slowly, her palms sweating. She placed her hand on the smooth surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a wave of light spread across the tower, racing up its height until the ceiling glowed. The screens around the chamber lit one by one, showing maps, signals, and streams of data. The hum deepened into a steady thrum of energy. Mara pulled her hand back, staring in awe. I did it?" Dan nodded. His eyes shone with quiet pride. "You did. Now the base is awake." Mara's chest rose and fell with quick breaths. She looked at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. She remembered when those hands had been tied with rough rope, when guards had dragged her through the market like an animal. Now those same hands had awakened machines older and stronger than she could imagine. The days that followed were filled with learning. Dan showed her how to read basic symbols on the screens. Some of the maps showed regions of the planet, marked with glowing lines. Others showed signals in the sky, ships moving across the stars. Mara could not understand it all, but she listened carefully and tried to learn. At night, she lay on her blanket and thought about the change in her life. She still remembered the cage, the fear, the cruel whispers of buyers. But those memories no longer crushed her. They were still heavy, but beside them now stood something new: purpose. One evening, Dan handed her a small device. "This is a control key," he said. "It connects to the base. If danger comes, it will respond to you." Mara held the device with trembling hands. It was small, but it felt heavy with meaning. "Why give this to me? You are the soldier, not me." Dan looked at her with steady eyes. "Because the base listens to you, not me. I can fight, but I cannot command the machines. Only you can." Her heart pounded. The thought of holding such responsibility frightened her, but it also filled her with pride. For the first time, she felt trusted. As the days passed, Mara began to move with more confidence. She no longer stayed in her corner, silent and afraid. She walked the chambers, learning which panels responded to her touch, which doors opened only for her. She even began to speak more, asking Dan questions about the base, about humanity, about the Empire. Dan answered patiently, though his voice always carried the weight of a man who had seen much pain. The Empire wants to keep humans weak, he explained one night. That is why they took you. That is why they fear places like this. But now, because of you, we have a chance. Mara listened, her heart heavy but strong. Do you think others like me exist? She asked. Perhaps, Dan said. But for now, you are the one we have. And that is enough. One afternoon, as Mara explored a chamber filled with old weapons, she touched a panel by accident. The racks came alive, rising from the floor with glowing lines along their edges. Dan rushed in at once, his face tense. But when he saw Mara standing there, the fear in his eyes softened into calm. It is all right, he said. The base responds to you, even here. You do not need to fear it. Mara nodded slowly. She reached out to one of the glowing weapons but stopped short. She had never held a weapon before, never thought herself capable. Dan saw her hesitation. You do not have to use it, he said. Your role is not to fight with blades or guns. Your role is to awaken what others cannot. That night, Mara thought long about his words. She realized she no longer felt like a slave waiting for commands. She felt like part of something larger, something that mattered. She remembered the villagers who had been taken, the faces she had lost. If this base could give humanity strength again, then perhaps their suffering would not be in vain. On the fifth morning, as she placed her hand on another console, the screen lit with a symbol she had not seen before, a red signal flashing across a map of the sky. Dan leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. Patrol ships, he said. Mara's stomach tightened. They are coming here. Not yet, Dan replied, his voice calm but firm. But they are close. We must be ready. The warning sent a chill through her, but she also felt a strange fire rise inside her. She was no longer helpless. She had awakened the base. She had a key in her hand that could call forth defenses. She looked at Dan, her voice steady. Then teach me more. Teach me how to protect this place. Dan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. We will begin at once. From that day, her lessons grew harder. Dan showed her how to command defense systems, how to activate shields, and how to direct energy lines through the base. At first, her hands shook, and her mind swam with fear of making mistakes. But each success, each glowing response of the machines, built her strength. At night, she no longer dreamed of chains. She dreamed of light, of machines awakening at her touch, of a world where humans stood free. She still feared the Empire, but now she carried something stronger than fear. She carried hope, and she carried power. And though the sky outside grew darker with the shadow of enemy ships, Mara knew she would not face it alone. The days after the warning signal were heavy with tension. Mara woke each morning with a knot in her stomach. She could see it in Dan's face too. He was calm as always, but his eyes often moved to the ceiling as if he could see the stars beyond the rock. The enemy was out there, searching. Mara trained harder than before. Dan guided her through the control panels, teaching her how to activate shields, open energy lines, and direct the defense systems. The more she practiced, the more natural it felt. Her hands no longer trembled when she touched the glowing panels. The base answered her like a loyal friend. But fear never left her completely. At night, she lay awake, listening to the hum of machines around her. She knew the Empire would not stop searching. They always found what they wanted. When she remembered the cages, the chains, and the market filled with cruel eyes, Her chest grew tight. She whispered to herself that she was no longer the same girl. She had power now. She had a place. She had Dan. One evening, as she studied the maps on the main screen, the red signal flashed again. This time it was closer. 3 bright dots moved steadily toward their sector of the sky. Mara's heart jumped. "They are coming," she whispered. Dan stepped closer and studied the map. "Yes. Small patrol ships. But they carry soldiers, and if they find this base, they will call the fleet." Mara's throat felt dry. "What do we do?" Dan placed a hand on her shoulder. "We fight. This is the moment we have prepared for." The words frightened her, but they also gave her strength. She straightened and looked at the screen with new resolve. Hours later, the first tremor shook the ground. The patrol ships had entered the atmosphere. Mara and Dan stood in the command chamber, the screens glowing around them. The base waited. The air buzzed with energy. "Mara," Dan said, his voice firm but calm. "The base will only respond to you. When the ships appear, you must activate the defenses. I will watch for openings. Trust yourself." Mara swallowed hard and nodded. Her hands hovered over the glowing controls. She could feel the machines beneath the surface, waiting for her touch. The next tremor came stronger. Dust fell from the ceiling. A screen lit up with an image of the sky above the base. 3 dark shapes cut through the clouds, their engines glowing. Mara's heart pounded. "They are here," she said. Dan's eyes narrowed. "Now, Mara. Raise the shields." Mara pressed her hand to the panel. A low hum spread through the ground. On the screen, a faint blue barrier shimmered around the cliffs that hid the base. The patrol ships circled, searching. For a moment, hope stirred in her chest. Perhaps they would not find the entrance. Perhaps they would pass. But then beams of red light shot from the ships, striking the cliffs. The shields flared, holding firm, but the ground shook with each blast. The ships had found them. Mara gasped. "They know." Dan's voice cut through her fear. "Then we show them this place is not weak. Target the nearest ship." Her hands shook as she reached for the panel. Symbols glowed beneath her fingers, and a deep vibration filled the chamber. On the screen, panels opened along the cliffs. Streams of bright energy shot into the sky, striking one of the ships. The ship shuddered, smoke trailing from its side. Mara's eyes widened. "I hit it?" "Yes," Dan said. Again. The second blast tore through the ship's wing. Flames spread, and the vessel spun out of control before crashing into the mountainside. The ground rumbled with the impact. Mara's chest heaved. She had done that. She, a girl once trapped in chains, had destroyed an enemy ship. The other 2 ships wheeled around, firing harder. Beams hammered the shield, sending ripples of light across the barrier. Mara felt sweat on her forehead. The shield's strength flickered on the screen, dropping lower with each strike. "They will break through," she said. "Then strike before they do," Dan ordered. His eyes never left the screens. "Do not let fear stop you. You are stronger than they know." Mara drew in a breath. Her hands steadied as she touched the panel again. This time she focused, guiding the energy with all her will. The base answered, and a volley of blasts shot upward, striking both ships in quick succession. One ship veered away, smoke trailing from its engines. The other exploded in the sky, pieces scattering like fire across the clouds. Mara flinched at the light but kept her hands firm on the controls. The last ship pulled higher, trying to escape. "They are running," she whispered. "Not running," Dan said, his face grim. "Reporting." Mara froze. If the pilot called the fleet, more ships would come. Larger ones. Stronger ones. The thought sent cold fear through her. Dan's voice was steady, but she heard urgency in it. Mara, you must stop that ship before it reaches orbit. Her chest tightened. She had never felt such weight on her before. If she failed, the Empire would come with full force. She thought of the cages, of the children she had seen dragged away, of her own tears in the darkness. She would not let that happen again. Mara pressed both hands on the console. The bass hummed louder, as if sharing her resolve. She focused on the fleeing ship, locking onto its signal. The panels on the cliffs glowed brighter than before. Then, with a sound like thunder, a massive beam shot upward. The ship shuddered in the sky, engines bursting. It spun out of control before exploding in a bright flash. The light faded, and the sky grew quiet. Mara slumped back, her breath coming fast. Her hands trembled, but she did not let go of the panel until the screens showed no more threats. They are gone, she whispered. Dan placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice calm but filled with pride. You did it. You defended this place. You defended us. Mara turned to him, her eyes wide. But they will come again. The pilot may have sent a signal before the end. Yes, Dan said. The Empire will not stop. But today, you proved we are not weak. You proved that hope is alive. Mara looked at her hands, still shaking, still glowing faintly from the panel's light. For the first time, she did not see them as the hands of a slave. They were the hands of someone who could fight back, who could change the future. That night, as she lay awake, the echoes of battle still filled her ears. She knew the war was only beginning. But she no longer felt powerless. The Empire would come again, stronger than before. And when they did, she would be ready. The silence after the battle did not last long. Mara knew it would not. 3 patrol ships were gone, and the Empire never ignored such losses. Each day after, she checked the sky maps with unease. The panels often flickered with static as if something far beyond the stars was searching for them. Dan was calm, but Mara saw the shadows in his eyes. He did not need to tell her what was coming. She already knew. They will send more, Mara said one morning as she stood beside him in the command chamber. The screens lit their faces with pale blue light. Yes, Dan replied. A fleet. This time they will come with full force. The words made Mara's stomach twist, but she did not look away. Then we fight with all we have. Dan studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. You are ready. From that moment, their days were filled with preparation. Mara learned to use deeper systems hidden within the base. Some panels required not only her touch but her will, her focus. When she placed her hand on them, images of stars, energy lines, and ancient maps filled her mind. The base had been built by a lost people long before her time, and now it had chosen her to command it. Dan showed her weapons that had been locked away. Energy cannons, guided drones, and shields that pulsed with light like living walls. Together, they tested each system. The cavern walls shook, the air hummed, and Mara felt both fear and awe at the power beneath her hands. At night, she and Dan sat near the glowing stones that warmed the sleeping quarters. She listened as he told her stories of Earth, of green fields, rivers, and skies untouched by war. Sometimes, he spoke of music and laughter, things she had never known. Mara closed her eyes and tried to imagine such a place. For the first time, she dared to believe that maybe, if they survived, she might see it one day. The signal came at dawn. The alarm lit the base in red. Mara rushed to the command chamber, her heart already racing. On the main screen, dozens of bright dots appeared, moving in formation. They were larger than patrol ships. Warships. They are here, Mara whispered. Dan stood tall beside her. His voice was steady. Then this is the day we make our stand. The ground trembled as the fleet entered the atmosphere. The sky above the mountains darkened with the shadows of their ships. The Empire had come with fire and steel. "Mara," Dan said firmly, "you must guide the base. I will hold the outer defenses. Together, we will not let them pass." Mara's hands pressed against the glowing console. She felt the hum of the base surge into her body, stronger than ever before. The machines waited for her command. The first blast struck the shield, shaking the cavern. Dust rained from the ceiling. Mara gritted her teeth and pushed more energy into the barrier. The shield shimmered brighter, holding back the fire. Dan activated the outer cannons. Beams of light streaked upward, striking the enemy ships. 2 warships shook under the impact, flames bursting along their sides. But the fleet kept pressing forward, their guns pounding the shield again and again. Mara's vision blurred from the strain. "I cannot hold it much longer," she gasped. "You can," Dan said. His voice cut through her fear like a blade. "The base listens to you. Trust it. Trust yourself." Mara drew in a sharp breath and focused. She closed her eyes, letting the hum of the machines guide her. She saw the energy lines running beneath the stone, ancient power flowing through channels like rivers of light. She reached for them, pulling them into the shield. The cavern shook, but the shield flared bright, stronger than before. On the screen, enemy blasts scattered harmlessly against it. Dan fired another volley. A warship exploded in the clouds, pieces raining down like burning stars. The sound echoed through the valley. But more ships pressed forward. Mara's chest burned with effort as she directed drones to rise from hidden chambers in the cliffs. Sleek shapes shot into the sky, weaving between enemy fire and striking at weak points. Explosions lit the heavens. The fleet was slowing, but it was not breaking. One massive ship descended lower, larger than all the others. Its cannons glowed with a deep red light. Mara's blood ran cold. Dan's face hardened. "That is the command ship. If it falls, the rest will scatter." Mara knew what that meant. She gathered every drop of strength she had, guiding the base's power toward one strike. Energy flowed into the cannons, into the drones, into the very stone of the mountain. The air crackled with heat. "Now, Mara," Dan shouted. "Release it." Mara slammed her hands onto the console. The base roared like thunder. A beam of pure white light shot upward, brighter than the sun. It struck the command ship straight through the center. The ship shuddered. Its glowing cannons dimmed. For a moment, silence held the sky. Then the massive vessel split apart in a storm of fire. The explosion shook the earth, lighting the clouds with a blazing glow. The other ships faltered. Some turned and fled. Others were torn apart by drones and cannon fire. Within minutes, the sky cleared. Smoke and fire drifted above the valley, but the fleet was broken. Mara collapsed to her knees, her body shaking from exhaustion. Her chest heaved with each breath. She had given everything she had, and the base had answered. Dan knelt beside her, steadying her with his hand. His eyes were fierce but filled with warmth. "You did it. You saved us." Mara looked at the screen. The Empire's fleet was gone. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of freedom settle over her. No chains, no cages, no voices shouting commands. Only silence, only air she could breathe without fear. But deep inside, she knew this was not the end. The Empire had many fleets, many commanders. They would not forget this loss. They would come again. Mara turned to Dan. "They will return. Stronger than before." Dan nodded slowly. "Yes. But so will we. And next time, we will not face them alone." Mara frowned. "What do you mean?" Dan looked at her with steady eyes. "You gave hope today, Mara. Not just to me, not just to this place. The signal of this battle will spread. Others will hear it. Others will rise. Her heart stirred at his words. She had never thought of herself as a leader. She had been a slave, a frightened girl. Yet now, she had stood against the Empire and won. Mara lifted her gaze to the stars beyond the cavern roof. They no longer seemed cold and distant. They seemed alive with promise. I will fight, she said softly. As long as I breathe, I will fight. Dan smiled faintly. Then humanity has a future. Together, they stood in the quiet command chamber, the screen still glowing with fading fire. Outside, the mountains stood tall, their peaks touched by dawn light. The first battle was over, but a greater journey was beginning. Mara no longer felt small. She no longer felt weak. She was part of something greater now, something that could change the stars themselves. And when the Empire returned, she would be ready.